Hello and welcome back to Simple Times Studios. Once again, we return to Jacob Flint's story, wrapping up the loose ends of our previous adventure. Jacob is now level 7 Wise Hunter. Unfortunately, the adventure ahead isn't going to be any easier. With Timmy Thunder free, Jacob Flint started to look for the secret escape route that the White Rabbit had used to escape without running into Jacob. The only other alternative was to go back the way Jacob originally came, which would take the both of them right where the hunter last left the Chimera robot. And with Tim being unarmed and Jacob being only armed with an axe, that was a confrontation he hoped to avoid. Okay, Jacob makes a perception check to find the secret escape that the streamer clearly took to slip away from them. He gets a 23 in total, and Tim is searching with him. Slowly, careful to avoid bleeding any more than he already had, Jacob began to search the Special Projects laboratory with more care than he did walking in. Tim started helping him search once it was clear what Jacob was looking for. Several minutes later, they had found it. A door hidden behind a server rack. At first it looked like the massive computer server couldn't be moved, but then Jacob spotted the wheels underneath it and the indentations on the floor. Slowly pushing it along the rough track, the two men uncovered a narrow metal door that opened into a claustrophobic spiral staircase that had clearly seen better days. Tim was just about to question the structural stability of their escape when a crash of metal on metal echoed from the elevator behind them. The Chimera had broken free and came down to cut the two of them off. Both men went up the stairs and shut the door behind them. It was a small comfort to Flint that the door they escaped through was too small for the homicidal robot to squeeze through. Racing up the stairs, and the metal staircase vibrating with every step they took, Jacob and Tim quickly climbed up and burst through the metal door at the end into sunlight. The escape staircase took them to a small parking lot right outside the building. The lot was empty. Jacob saw signs that some kind of vehicle had been parked here and fresh tire tracks leading out to the road. Still, they were outside. The road back to civilization was clear, and they both had cell phone reception again. And as soon as they got reception again, their phones both buzzed with several missed calls. Time for a story that folks almost certainly wouldn't believe. Okay, does Jacob need extended care for his injuries? I give it a 50-50, and 78% says no. Several weeks later, after being in and out of hospital getting his injuries treated, Jacob was back to his normal routine. On the positive, he didn't need any more than a couple stitches to get back together. On the negative, a lot of the evidence of his captivity and captor had vanished. The Chimera robot had disappeared. No one had heard of a male live streamer named White Rabbit. And the computer was a burner built explicitly for recording the game Jacob had been run through. If it wasn't for a video Quimby's people managed to pull from the computer, Jacob and Tim wouldn't have anything but their word that anything that happened in the abandoned factory actually happened. Even then, the case quickly reached a dead end. There was nothing the police could track or anything Jacob and Tim could quietly look into on their own. Jacob was used to that, though Tim was decidedly less so. Fortunately, Tim decided to deal with this setback by focusing on some personal project of his. What that was, Tim wouldn't tell Jacob, but Jacob and the rest of the town soon found other things to worry about. Dr. Godson was back and had quietly purchased the old Emerald Lake summer camp, hiring on contractors to renovate it and convert it into a wellness retreat and chapter house for his mega church. It was the beginning of a song and dance that Jacob had seen before. Already there was a town meeting scheduled. Godson and his new purchase almost certainly going to be the main topic of discussion. And the good doctor of theology himself was likely going to be in attendance as well. If that happened, Flint already knew how the debate would go. Dr. Godson would argue that his purchase of the property was entirely legal and none of the town's concern, which, at least as far as Jacob understood the law, was unfortunately correct. Jacob also knew the doctor would also use this to ignore or otherwise weasel his way out of the growing laundry list of actual issues the town had with his presence, one of which was playing out right in front of Flint as he tried to run some errands. Jacob had just parked his truck in front of the local ag supply store on Main Street, trying to get some replacement parts for his irrigation system. He looked around, mentally checked off all the places he needed to visit, then noticed the crowd that was forming outside of Our Lady of Mercy. Seeing the people gathered, he climbed back into his truck and pulled out his phone. The small stone church of Our Lady of Mercy was the only church the town was large enough to support. Jacob was not much for religion. The horrors of the lodge and the hypocrisy of Dr. Godson made it too hard for him to believe in a benevolent God. But Father Gabriel, the Catholic priest heading the congregation, was a good man. Or at least, a good enough man that didn't deserve the crowd that was forming in front of his church. A handful of individuals had gathered outside the stone steps of Our Lady of Mercy. One reading aloud from Godson's published Bible, and two were handing out pamphlets. The rest were just shouting at the church, condemning Gabriel as a heretic and a profaner of the holy word of the Lord. Jacob wasn't sure the priest was even in the church today as he dialed the sheriff's office non-emergency number. Hello? Hi, Rachel. Yeah, it's me again. I'm in the parking lot at the ag supply store across the street from Our Lady of Mercy. Thought you and the sheriff would like to know that they're at it again. No, they haven't seen me yet. I'm going to try and start my truck and just do my errands in the next town over. Okay, do the followers of Godson's church notice Flint? I think that it's unlikely given their focus on their task and he hasn't made any waves yet, so... 91 says no. Looks like Flint won't have to tangle with a bunch of televangelist devotees yet. Jacob started his truck and pulled out of the parking lot before driving out of town. Running errands had become a pain in the neck now. It was half an hour one way to the next town, yet he needed to do it. Godson still wouldn't let their shared history go, and Jacob was becoming a bit of a celebrity in Godson's church. The first man, the good doctor, cured of sin. Jacob was surprised Godson's devotees hadn't tried trespassing on his property yet all the more reason to keep his weapons close at hand. Finishing his errands took the better part of the morning. Jacob returned to his homestead around lunch and unloaded his truck with his shotgun worn over his back. He had just put everything away and started to cook a can of soup on the stove when he got the call. Flint residence, he began as he picked up the unknown number. That was a mistake before. He could only hope it wasn't a mistake again. Hello, Jacob. I was hoping to get in touch with you before that town meeting, Godson replied with a swarmy smile that Jacob could practically hear in his voice. Jacob realized he needed to start blocking unknown numbers. Dr. Godson, whatever you want, the answer's no, Jacob replied as he finished heating up his soup and poured it into a bowl. Jacob, we both want what's good for the town, Godson pretended to plead, yet Jacob could hear the malice starting to form in his voice. Jacob laughed at this as he set his soup on the kitchen table. Again, the answer's no. See you at the town meeting tomorrow, he replied and started to hang up. No, you'll see me before that. I'm done humoring you, Flint, Godson replied angrily and hung up first. Jacob sighed and stood up. As his soup continued to cool, the wise hunter walked over to his gun cabinet and pulled out his shotgun. Making sure it was loaded, he then pulled out an empty bandolier and started filling it with shells. He knew Godson well enough to know that he didn't have a lot of time. Alright, I'm going to roll a d4 and have Jacob get ambushed by two of Godson's followers. I'm going to use the cult initiate stat block, as the cult tree seems to fit the most. Does Jacob hear them coming? 1d20 plus 9, and he gets a 12. So, let's say they're actually trying to be stealthy and use the back door. No surprise round for either group then. Flint gets a 3 on his initiative, and they get a 20 on a 1d20 plus 1 for theirs. Well, at least they got the drop on him. Jacob finished loading his bandolier and sat back down to enjoy his soup, keeping his shotgun close and facing the entryway so he could watch for someone to try the front door. And then he heard a creak from his right. The back door. He spun around in his chair and raised his shotgun, but the two fanatics were faster, both attempting to wrestle the gun out of his hands. Okay, going to attempt a disarm roll. The cultist makes a 1d20 plus 10 strength check and gets a 10. Flint makes an opposing roll and gets a 21 on a 1d20 plus 4. Guess they fail. And with them moving in and grappling with him, that ends their turn. Flint managed to pull his shotgun away from them and didn't hesitate, bringing it to bear against the one closest to him and pulling the trigger. Okay. Flint hits with a 21 on a 1d20 plus 4. He does 11 points of damage on a 2d6 plus 1. He beats the cult initiate's defense of 12, and with only 9 HP, that guy is on the floor. The gun went off with a deafening roar and threw one of Flint's attackers on the hardwood floor. Practice hands quickly chambered another round, and he turned to the other of Godson's flock. You want some of this too? Okay, now normally the cult family of antagonists have a rule that makes them immune to being frightened, but let's ask the Dice Oracle if Flint made this idiot reconsider his life choices anyway. I give it a 50-50, and I get a 6. I guess having his buddy get completely wasted right in front of him would do that. The second of Godson's henchmen immediately backed away and looked at Flint with terror in his eyes. Why? Why did you do that? Screw you, that's why. Flint shot back as he pulled out his phone and dialed up the sheriff's office emergency number. Hi, it's Jacob Flint. I'm at my house at 1 Outskirt Road and I need an ambulance. 2 people tried to break into my house, and one's now bleeding on the floor with a chest full of buckshot. Understood, Mr. Flint. A car is already on its way, and I'm notifying the ambulance company now. You should see someone in 5 minutes. What's the state of the other intruder? Staring at me like a deer in the headlights while I have a 12 gauge pointed at him. Please don't shoot him. The police are already on their way. Don't worry, as long as he doesn't try anything else, he should still be alive when the police get here. Why do you insist on defying Dr. Godson after all he's done for you? The second fanatic suddenly shouted, still keeping his distance from Flint's shotgun. Because if my salvation depends on people like that two-faced snake oil salesman, then the devil can have my soul, the hunter shot back, his index finger hovering millimeters from the trigger and painfully aware that the dispatcher on the other end heard all of that. Several minutes of uncomfortable silence later, the police arrived and the ambulance right behind them. The surviving henchman was arrested, and the one Flint shot was still alive and taken to the hospital. Statements were taken, and soon Flint was left alone with a blood-stained floor. Cleaning it up wouldn't take too long, but first, he pulled out his phone and dialed the last number before his afternoon was ruined. Flint's call was sent to voicemail, but that didn't matter. That just meant he couldn't get interrupted before he could say his piece. Hello, Doctor. It's Flint again. I dealt with both of the guys you just sent. One's going to the hospital, the other's going to jail, he replied coldly before hanging up. Blood on his kitchen floor was mopped up, and Jacob thought about what he needed to do next. There was only one way out of this. There always was only one way out of this. He just never took it because there would always be consequences. but shaking his head, he grabbed the rest of his gear and made sure he was fully loaded on ammunition before heading out. Locking his front door behind him, he went into the direction of the old Emerald Lake camp and started walking. Time to go hunting. The trek to the camp was slow going. Flint slowly hiked along and took care to avoid disturbing as much of the summer foliage as he could. Along the way, he kept an ear open for an ambush. It was unlikely that Dr. Godson would send someone out this quickly. It wasn't likely that he would even believe Flint's message at first. Perhaps it was a good thing. It would give Flint time to either pull this off or convince him that this was a stupid idea. Okay, does Flint encounter anything on the way to Emerald Lake? I gave it a 50-50. And 69, nice, says no. It was a long, uneventful walk through the woods to the northern end of Emerald Lake. As he came in sight of the lake's rocky shore, he took care to stay behind a tree line. The old camp was along the southern shore and was currently a flurry of activity. Crouching down behind a large oak, he pulled out his binoculars and started to see what he could. What he saw chilled him to the bone, and yet he found he couldn't look away. Godson had gathered his supporters right by the camp entrance and was addressing them, while someone else was handing out assault rifles. The gathering was still too far away for Jacob to make out what they were saying, but he spotted several flashing lights heading towards the camp entrance. Police cars? Was the sheriff getting tired of Godson's antics? Rising to his feet, he put away his binoculars and drew his rifle before slowly creeping around the lake towards the southern side. Okay, Flint attempts a stealth check to sneak up on the brewing confrontation unobserved. He rolls a 7 on a 1d20 plus 4. So he fails, but not by much. I think I know how he fails. Moving slowly to keep from being heard, he moved around the lake at a snail's pace. As he approached the camp, a single gunshot rang out before the forest echoed with a gunsmith's symphony. Jacob's trained ear picked up at least 3 different calibers used in the gunfight in front of him. And it was in front of him, where the police looked like they were gathering for a standoff. Damn it. Flint slowed his step. The road had just started to appear past the tree line as 4 squad cars raced back in the direction of town. Okay, were the police forced to retreat? I give it a 50-50 that they did. If not, there is something more sinister going on. 30 says yes, it was them. Flint is alone in the forest with an unknown number of armed fanatics that don't know he's here yet. Surveying the road from his position, Jacob crouched down in the underbrush and listened. Even as close as he was, the shouting at the front of the camp was still hard to make out. Okay, Jacob is making another perception check. He gets a 16 on a 1d20 plus 9. Not a lot, but certainly enough. Jacob still couldn't make out what Godson was saying, but he could hear a crowd cheer in response and the sound of several engines turning on. He spotted 4 trucks at the gate, armed with believers piling into the back of each truck. There was no way this was going to lead to anything good. But as he drew his rifle, an idea started to form. Something that might buy the town enough time to get the National Guard or something involved. Keeping as low to the ground as he could, his hunting rifle sticking out from underneath the bush, he waited as the convoy revved up and started to drive down the dirt road leading back into town. Jacob inhaled and held his breath steady as he got the lead vehicle in his iron sights and slowly adjusted his aim to lead the target. Driver or front tire? He asked the question and answered it in an instant, pulling the trigger. Okay. Jacob was going to attempt to shoot the tire on the lead truck with his hunting rifle. He gets a 21 on a 1d20 plus 4. Yeah, that should hit. And with his major feat gorilla, he should get one more free shot before he needs to move. His rifle cracked. The front driver's tire exploded in a shower of shattered rubber. The lead pickup truck nearly flipped over and threw its rear occupants onto the road as the driver struggled to regain control of the vehicle, and the other trucks came to a more controlled stop behind it. Flint quickly went through the motions of pulling back the bolt and chambering another round. Now for the rear vehicle. He only had one more shot before he needed to run. Okay, Jacob is going to take his second shot. And this time he gets a 13 on a 1d20 plus 4. Not as good, but the vehicle is not in motion, so he might have damaged the rim. Not as crippling, but it might come up later. Shifting his aim from the front to the rear of the convoy, Jacob quickly fired off a shot that pinged off the rear vehicle's rim. Not quite the effect he was hoping for, but it definitely motivated the driver of the rear vehicle to stay inside the cab. Unfortunately, his opponent wasn't stupid. The footmen dismounted and made sure to keep their vehicles between them and the general direction of the mysterious sharpshooter harrying them. They had a rough idea where he was. It was time to move. But was Godson among them? Is Godson among his followers on this excursion? I find it very unlikely that he would lead from the front like this, so a 25 or higher is a no. And at 81, the Dice Oracle agrees with me. Flint is going to attempt a stealth check to slip away. He gets a 13 on a 1d20 plus 4. He succeeds, but not without some consequence. Jacob couldn't spot Godson anywhere. Of course it wouldn't be that easy. Standing up into a crouch, he darted out from the underbrush and back into the forest. There was a shout as someone spotted him and bullets whizzed past his head, but soon he disappeared past the first foothill. Once he was out of sight, he straightened up and broke into a full run. His mind immediately raced as he continued to run. There was bound to be a few that split off to chase after him, if not the whole group. He couldn't lead them to his home or to town. He slowed down to try and listen. Were they still following him, and how many? Okay. Are they still following him? I say it's very likely, so I'm going to ask the Dice Oracle. And 38 says yes, they definitely are. 2d10 sounds like a good amount to chase after him, and I get 11. 11 members of Godson's church are chasing after him. And since they're not subtle and shouting at each other, I imagine he doesn't need to make a perception check to notice them and get a rough count of how many are looking for him. Flint slowed his pace and steadied his breath before listening to the sounds of the forest. The wind blowing through the trees, the birds cawing and chirping above, the shouts and calls of about 10 gunmen confident in their superiority that they didn't care about giving away their positions to their prey. 10 gunmen, likely all armed with AR-15 style assault rifles if his previous glimpse at them was accurate. Spread out in a rough semicircle behind him that was currently keeping pace with him. If he wanted to get some distance from them so he could start looking for a place to dig in, he was going to have to pick up the pace. And it looks like I should turn this into a foot chase through a park or woodlands. We're going to go for 4 rounds, and this will be a mid-level chase encounter. Flint rolls on a natural 20 on his 1d20 plus 1. We'll use the cultist stat block again for Godson's pursuing foot soldiers. They get a 20 on a 1d20 plus 1 as well. So Flint wins by GM Fiat. Flint begins to pick up the pace as he raced through the forest. Someone shouted behind him as the chase began in earnest. Okay. Roll the 9, open field. Jake is going to roll an endurance check to just hoof it. He needs to beat a 15 and gets a 17 on a 1d20 plus 6. His pursuers get an 11. That's 1-0 in Jacob's favor. The forest soon opened up to a large, relatively flat meadow. Jacob saw his opportunity to gain some ground and took it, picking up the pace and started to race across the open meadow. Pushing himself as sweat dripped down his face, Jacob raced across the length of the open meadow, just as his opponents broke through the tree line. A few shouted after him, but Jacob could have sworn he saw a couple looking winded already. Okay. Rolled a 5, rushing stream. Jacob is going to make an athletics check to swim the stream. He gets a 13 on a 1d20 plus 4. He fails barely. The cultists attempt to pursue, and they get a 14. They both fail. Jacob is still in the lead. Just disappearing back among the trees and still running along, Flint soon heard the sound of rushing water. He knew there was a deep stream around here that cut across his route, but it came up sooner than he expected. One moment his foot was on solid ground, the next it was in open air for a split second before he began to fall in. Landing in the deep water with a splash, Flint started to try to swim downstream. Muscles ached and burned as the water current did most of the work carrying him along. Behind him, his pursuers reached the stream's edge and ran upstream to ford in the more shallow parts. Even then, he could see some of them slip and fall in the water before climbing back to their feet and reaching the other side as he continued to float downstream. Okay, rolled a 7, steep grove. Jacob is going to attempt to start a landslide. He gets a 21 on his 1d20 plus 6. His pursuers make a dexterity save and get a 19. He wins. Jacob is 2-0, and this is round 3, so I'm just going to say he wins. He disappears into the forest. Pulling himself out of the stream and onto the shore, Jacob rose to his feet and started running again. Clothes and gear dripping wet, he continued running deeper into the forest. His opponents continued to keep up off in the distance, at least until his path started to acquire a serious, rocky incline. Thinking quickly, he started to climb straight up the slope, and when his pursuers arrived at the bottom, started a landslide with a single well-aimed kick. The gunman ran to avoid getting buried, and by the time the path cleared, Jacob was long gone. Now deep in the forest, with the sun starting to set, Jacob decided to risk a small fire to dry his equipment and clothes. The crackling light of the flame was a calming influence as the hunter finally allowed himself some time to think. Admittedly, this was not one of his better days or better plans. He needed to try and get a hold of someone back in town, make sure everyone was all right, and that there was still a town left when this was done. Once he got a signal out and learned what happened since he went into the forest, then it was time to go hunting. End of story.